Welcome, creative adventurers. I'm Debbie Cohn from D Cohn Designs. I'm so glad you're here today. It's week 3 of our It's Christmas Time quilt along. In today's video, we're going to cover how to construct the trees block. Last week we constructed our presents block. This week it's trees, and we'll get started in just a moment. Before we do, please, if you would like this video, go ahead and give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Then go ahead and head on over to my website at D Cohn Designs, because that's where you'll find the patterns for our quilt along. They are free, a PDF download, and also an overview of the quilt along and the fabric requirements. Again, these are all free through November 30th, 2021. So be sure to go download your free patterns and quilt along overview. I hope you'll join me. Let's get started. As you can see here, I have my print 10-inch squares. I'm using Red Barn Christmas from Sweetwater. So those are already pre-cut 10-inch squares. I'm going to move on to cutting my background. As you can see, I've cut a straight edge, cut the selvages and cut a straight edge on my background fabric, some yardage here. And I'm going to cut off 10 inches and subcut that into the 5 10-inch squares I need. And then there'll be additional yardage that I'll need to cut up for the other smaller rectangles. Consult your pattern for the exact pieces and sizes that you'll need. Let's go ahead and cut up some of this yardage. So I've got it on the 1-inch mark because it's easier for me to cut and you can see what I'm doing. So I've lined it up. I'm using my ruler and I've used a hand weight to hold the ruler steady, and my rotary cutter to cut carefully all the way down. Next, I'm going to subcut into 10-inch squares. Before I subcut my yardage, I just want to remind you of a couple of quick things. You're going to want to iron your yardage for sure, and you may want to starch your yardage in some way. Some folks do, some folks don't. If that's what you prefer, then go ahead and use your starch, your best press, your flatter, or whatever works best for you. I choose to use a spray starch for me on my yardage. Please don't starch your pre-cuts though, because they will shrink, and in this pattern you will need the full amount of your pre-cuts for some of the pattern pieces. Okay, let's go ahead and subcut into our 10-inch squares. Okay, there are 4 10-inch squares. I'll open some more yardage and cut the remaining square, along with subcutting the other pieces. Okay, here I'm subcutting my bases for my trees and the sides of my blocks. I've doubled the fabric to make it go a little bit faster. There's one set. Another set. This last set for the block sides, I'll need 10, so I'm going to make 5 cuts at 2 each. 10. That's all of our background pieces that we'll need at this point. Here we have our pieces cut so far. Obviously fabric A, fabric C, E, F, and G. You'll remember that I mentioned not to cut your fabric B or your fabric D yet, because you're going to cut those out of the leftovers from fabric A and fabric C when you combine them together. You'll see what I mean in the next step. Before we get started actually cutting out our trees, I wanted to show you my test block. As you may remember from week 2, I am making a test block of each of the blocks out of flannel scraps that I've got in my stash. So here's our tree block. You can see it's a triangle with a small base. It's not actually difficult. The hardest part will be cutting out the triangle, and I've got some tips to help you. It should be quick and easy. This first step in cutting out the trees, you're going to need your ruler like this and a pencil or chalk. I normally would use pencil, but I will go over my marks with chalk so that you can see them better. I don't recommend using pen of any kind unless it's specially made for marking fabric, because regular ballpoint pen or Sharpie or anything like that is going to bleed possibly, and I don't want you to ruin your quilt. The first thing we're going to do is to measure over it and mark the center of our 10-inch square at the top with a mark. Like that. I've marked it along the top of the square. Now I'm going to measure down at the center and mark a dot in pencil or chalk. I'm going to measure down 1 1/4 inches. You may notice that my pre-cut is measured by the manufacturer so that it's valley to valley on the zigzag sides. So I've centered my pre-cut so that the peaks are just over the line all the way around on 10 inches. Now I'm going to measure down and mark. That way you can see it. Actually, you would want to put a dot. You can see that a little bit right there. That will be where we're going to cut the point of our triangle. Next, we will measure up 1 1/2 inches from the bottom of the 10-inch square and mark it on each side. Next, we're going to measure in at the 1 1/2 inch line. We're going to measure in 1 1/4 inches on both sides and mark a dot. Okay, you can see that I have my 3 points for the triangle, one here, and one here. And you'll remember that I have layered my A square and my C square. We want to cut them together. The next thing to do is to cut through both layers of fabric along the triangle. So I'm going to line up my ruler at the dots on the angle, and I'm going to cut with my rotary cutter. It's okay to cut all the way through from this dot all the way up to the top of the square. Just don't cut through this bottom section down here. You'll need that later. So carefully start at this mark here and go all the way up and cut. Like that. And then you're going to do the same thing on the other side. You're going to line your ruler up at the points here and here. Like that. And carefully cut all the way through from the lower dot, like that. You're going to cut across the 2 dots and cutting off that 1 1/2 inches off the bottom, which you will save and use towards your trunk pieces. So don't discard any of this. Let's cut that now. I find it easier to rotate the fabrics, making sure they're lined up. And cut. Okay, so you're going to need the triangle, the print triangle. You'll need the print triangle. Hold the background triangle for something else, and then you'll need your background base and your background print on the lower part. You'll also need your background of the triangle sections. You'll use to form the background of the tree, and then you can hold on to the excess print for something else later in the quilt. So you may remember I told you a little bit earlier not to cut your fabric B or D yet. You're cutting that out of the leftovers. So here you can see 2 strips from the bottom of the block that you cut off, which were beneath the triangle section. You're going to use the print and subcut your fabric B out of that, and then use the background and subcut your fabric D out of that. So just refer to your pattern and subcut those pieces and you'll be ready to move on. All right, now that you have your triangle pieces cut, the next thing we're going to do is to begin stitching the background to the triangle. The way you're going to do that is first, you're going to sew along the left side. Be sure you start with the left side, otherwise you'll have to rip it out and do it again. Ask me how I know, I've done it. So what you're going to do is flip this over and you're going to match the bottom corner of the triangle with this point on the background, like that. And then along the top, and then you're going to take it to the machine, sew a 1/4 inch seam right sides together. Then you're going to do the same thing. You'll flip this back, and then you're going to match it again at the base down here, right there at the corner, and then you're going to right sides together, sew a 1/4 inch seam. You'll end up stitching across the other one. That's okay. You want it like that. Then once you're done, you'll flip it back, iron it, and you'll have your tree embedded in the background. Let's get started sewing. You may notice several different prints when I'm sewing the blocks together. That's because when I was sewing the tree sections, I sewed them backwards, and so I had to fix them and redo it again and reshoot the filming. So I apologize for the discrepancies, but this time I have it correct. So I'm sewing the left side of the tree together first with the background. That's very important. Right sides together, 1/4 inch seam, and I do pin just a little bit because it is a bias edge and we want to keep it from distorting and stretching. Next, we're going to add the other side and sew down the right side of the triangle. Next, we're going to sew down the right side of the triangle. Here you can see that I've gently finger pressed back the seam, and now I'm going to add on the other side, the right hand side, matching the corners at the bottom, and then the top I will pin up here, here, and down here, and then we will stitch. You can see that I've pinned the right side on, right sides together, and I'm going to sew across the part I've already sewn. That's perfectly fine, and stitch with a 1/4 inch seam. And we're done. So now we're ready to press. Again, you're going to want to just iron very gently. And that's how it should look. Minus, of course, the really raggedy looking seams, but that's how it should look. Let's do that. Okay, there's the tree portion, and now we're ready to trim the tree unit. Consult your pattern for the exact dimensions. One tip I want to give you is that when you're measuring to trim your tree unit, you need to measure from the base of the unit, from down here, from the base of the tree upward. But first you need to trim the base of the tree so that it's even. There's always slight bobbles when you're sewing, no problem. And then you're going to measure up the required amount, and then you'll cut. And then you'll want to trim the sides as well. What I do is I do my best to center the tree and then cut it to the dimensions in the pattern. Our tree unit is trimmed, and now we're ready to start the trunk unit. Okay, you can see that we have our trunk sections here. We have our fabric B, our print, which will be the actual trunk of the tree. Then we have two fabric D rectangles, which we will sew on either side of the trunk. We're going to go ahead and sew with a 1/4 inch seam, right sides together, sewing the D rectangle on each side of our trunk. Okay, now we're ready to press and trim. So here's our trunk unit. Let me show you the back. You can see that I've pressed the seams open and I've trimmed it to size. Now we're going to go ahead and center up our trunk underneath the tree and stitch the two sections together to make our tree section. You can see when I'm stitching the tree body to the tree trunk unit that I've pinned it just to make sure that the pieces don't shift. Here again, when you're measuring the height of the unit, be sure to measure from the base of the trunk. Be sure you even it up first and then measure up from the base of the trunk to get the correct height of the unit. And then when you're measuring the width of the unit, then center the block and then square it up. Okay, I've got my tree and trunk unit. I'm going to sew on the fabric E, which will raise the block up. Then after we press the seam open, then we will measure and then cut down approximately 1 inch or so to make the block the correct size. Let's get sewing. It could be as little as 1/2 inch, so check your measurements before you cut. As you can see, I've pressed the seam open and now I'm ready to trim the block down to size. This is one of the upper trees. I'm going to cut approximately 1/2 inch, not 1 inch, but 1/2 inch off the top, and that will make this tree offset higher, and there will be 3 higher trees. It'll look like this. There you go. The last thing we need to do for this block is to add the 2 side pieces and it'll be done. Here is the lower tree block. We're going to add a fabric F to the top, and that will ensure that this tree is the lower while the other one is the higher offset. We'll make 2 lower trees. Now I'm sewing the fabric F piece to the lower block. I'll press the seam open and then I will go ahead and add the sides. As you can see, here are the 2 blocks side by side. On the left is the higher offset block and on the right is the lower offset block. The only thing we have left to do is add our fabric G's to each side of both blocks and the set will be done. Here are both the high and low offset blocks with their fabric G's. All I need to do now is press them back and trim the block to size and we're done. And finally, here are the blocks. The upper offset tree is on the left, the lower offset tree is on the right. You're going to make 3 upper trees and 2 lower trees, alternating them on the row. Have fun! If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please tell a friend as well. It's not too late to join our Christmas quilt along. Please also go ahead and visit my blog and my shop at dconedesigns.com. There you can download this week's pattern as well as last week's pattern and the quilt along overview. Next week, please stay tuned. We will be doing our houses row and block, and the free pattern will be available then. See you soon. Take care.